Gardening is universal. No matter where we live, what we grow, or how we garden, we share the same instinct to nurture something and watch it flourish. With more than 3 decades in the garden industry, Paul Zimmerman explores the passion that connects gardeners around the world with those who also live in it. Drawing on years of travel, conversations with international growers and hobby gardeners, and countless visits leading garden tours everywhere from France to England to New Zealand, Paul looks beyond the how-to and dives into the deeper questions. Why do we garden? What's changing in the gardening world? And what does it reveal about who we are? Please welcome your host, Paul Zimmerman.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to A World of Gardening, my podcast, new episode. My guest this time around is going to be Rita Perwich. She has just written a book called Natural Rose Gardening, The Organic Guide to Growing Amazing Blooms. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Rita joined me on my tour of France, and we talked about French gardens and went off from there. So stay tuned for that in just a little bit. But first, another episode of Paul's Journal. A few things here. The garden tour that I was leading finished last Saturday in Lyon. I am now in Perpignan, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. We had a great group, really nice group, 13 gardeners all together. Wonderful mix of new rose growers. One person actually only had one rose, and we had very experienced rose growers. I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. It was fun to talk to all the different levels. It was interesting to talk to the new gardeners, in particular, the ones who were new to roses, because they still had in their mind about, the rose had to be perfect and the chemicals. And one of the joy about taking them through France is that pressure's not there in this country. So they really, as the week went on, I began to see them relax about their own roses. And they would say things, so I don't have to worry about a little black spot. And I would say, no, you don't have to worry about a little black spot. Just let it go. Don't worry about it. As the French do, just, have another glass of wine. Why not? That's the thing to do. So that was a lot of fun. The group asked a ton of questions, and I love that. I always say that the best way I know that people are engaged with something I'm doing is if they're asking questions and talking about it. And I don't give lectures on my garden tours. If you ever want to come on a future one, please do so. I actually like to teach spontaneously the entire time. And when we first started in Lyon, the first thing I told him was, I want you to ask questions, but don't wait for a formal question and answer time. Ask them at breakfast, ask them on the bus, ask them at lunch. Stop me in the garden if you see something and go, what about this or what about that? This is a 7-day tutorial classroom, basically, that we're conducting. And I like that because that way they ask a question. I know that I'm answering something they specifically want answered. If they have follow-up questions, we're standing in front of the rose or we're standing in front of the situation. So I really enjoyed that. They were very, very engaged. I'm not going to go into the gardens we visited. Rita and I are going to touch on that. So I'm really just kind of wait for that. You'll hear about that in just a little bit. I'm in Perpignan, as I mentioned earlier, and these are my clients, design clients. The site is Chateau Latour Apollinaire. I believe I have that right. My French is getting a little better, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. And I'm going to talk to the owners in a podcast for the future, so I won't go into a lot of details. And I did do a video on when I first got here last year. I did a video of what we were dealing with, and I will do a follow-up video, so look for that on my YouTube channel. But one of the things that we're dealing with, and this is kind of what I want to talk about a little bit here, is the soil compaction. It's been neglected for a long, long time. And the owners of the chateau are very much into using natural methods, organic methods, pollinator-friendly, bee-friendly, which brings me to cover crops. And that's essentially what we're doing here, is we're doing cover crops. The owner, Victoria, has done an enormous amount of research about what does well with the soil here, how it works. And there is clover, white clover planted in a lot of the beds, even where the roses are. They keep it sort of chopped away, but that's obviously a nitrogen fixing or brings nitrogen into the soil. And the idea these cover crops eventually will die, will go away, will get turned in, and things along those lines. And cover crops have always had the perception of being something that you use in farming on large scale, but they actually do work for the home garden. I want to share just a couple tips that I've been reading as I've been studying a little bit more about this. Some of them you're going to have to dig in. So if you plant something like, crimson clover or field peas or other legumes, come spring, you're going to have to dig them in, chop them up, et cetera, and that becomes a little bit of work. But there are some things you can do just to build up the organic matter. And the two that were talked about are oats is one of them. And that creates a fairly thick mat. It's organic material. It prevents winter weeds. They actually advise sowing them in late summer. And then when you get a winter freeze, if you live in an area where you get a winter freeze, obviously, they'll die. And what'll be left is this mat of organic matter that's going to help keep the winter weeds down. And then come spring, just plant through it. Don't actually get it out of the garden. Just let it decompose and add to the garden. That's the one they really talked about. The other one they talked about is daikon radish. And that is basically the purpose of that is if you have clay soil like I have at home, you plant them and they put their roots incredibly deep and they break up the clay soil. They basically just break up the compaction far deeper than you could probably reach with a tool or a machine. And of course, they're going to do that without tilling up the soil and disturbing the soil life environment that you've been trying to create that we've talked about. So daikon radish. And daikon radish, like the oats, will die when there comes a winter freeze. So they'll do their job. They will then die out. You get this top layer of just sort of dead organic matter that will sit on your garden in the wintertime, help suppress winter weeds. Come spring, as they talk about, you just plant right through it. Don't get it out of there. Don't till it in. So great for a beginner, a combination of oats and daikon radish into your cover crops. And now I'd like to get into the interview with Rita. She's done a lot, Rita. I've known her for a while. She's been on one of my tours before. We've always corresponded. She's the editor for Roses and You, which is an e-newsletter for the American Rose Society. She's a master gardener. She's a consulting rosarian, been growing roses and gardening for well over 30 years in Southern California. And she's just had a book published, Natural Rose Gardening, The Organic Guide to Growing Amazing Blooms, published by Chelsea Green. I actually had the pleasure of pre-reading it. She asked me to write the foreword to the book, which was very flattering. So, of course, I read it ahead of time. Very well written, very good information, accessible information. Some of these things can get a little bit too complicated. Rita keeps it really, really good. It's available right now on pre-order. Amazon and other book outlets have it. And I just want to read you a quick paragraph about in the foreword that I wrote. And I think this sums it up really well from the foreword that I wrote. Rita's book is a wonderfully detailed guide to growing roses without chemicals, without complicated feeding programs, and a healthy dose of fun. It strikes a fine balance between broad overview and detailed practical instruction, showing you step by step how to bring her ideas into your own garden. That's not a simple thing to do, but she does it well, in terms that are easy to follow and understand. Easy, yet comprehensive, just like nature's balance. That is part of the foreword that I wrote to Rita's book. And without further ado, let's join Rita on my garden tour in France in the Beaujolais Valley. Rita, welcome to A World of Gardening. And speaking of A World of Gardening, we're sitting here in France.
I know. Thank you, Paul. This is such a wonderful opportunity. First of all, we did the UK, and now here we are in France, and these roses are just gorgeous.
Yeah, and it's fun to compare, gardening and not just rose growing, but gardening in general in America. And like you said, England we've done and now France. I mean, do you have some takeaways from this past week and what you notice about the way the French do things?
I have noticed in all the gardens that we've been to in France that there is complete focus on not using pesticides and everything being organic. And it's not like that's anything new. They've been doing that for years and years and years. And I just noticed while we were in the gardens that there's very, very little pest damage, strikingly very little pest damage. So it's wonderful to know how while organic gardening is working, it's just proof that it works.
Yeah, you see it in the gardens, and like you said, they take great pride in it. I mean, I've said all along that, pesticides and fungicides have been unavailable in Europe for years and years and years. And like you said, they take enormous pride. I mean, the gardens we walk into, sometimes the first word out of the mouth is very proudly, we don't use chemicals.
Yes, that's and also there were signs along the way. They're all in French. Luckily, I went to French school a week of little intensive French school before I came here, but a lot of signs with a lot of pride talking about habitats for insects, habitats for the bees, habitats for lady beetles and the lizards, and how pollinators and beneficial insects are good for all of us.
Yeah, I think it's a good observation because they don't really differentiate between where plant gardening ends and insect or beneficial pollinator gardening begins. It's the same thing.
It is the same thing. And I think that's where our success in growing good roses, I think a lot of times we focus in America on, okay, how do we grow this great rose? And I think what we really need to be focusing on is how do we grow a really healthy garden? Because once you grow that really healthy garden, your roses are going to be, they're plants, they're going to be healthy as well. And if you take the focus away from the rose and away from perhaps, oh, okay, it's got a blemish on it, and away from it's got to be perfect, and just concentrate on the health of your garden, you, you're naturally going to have, a healthier garden and a healthier rose.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've observed, and I'm just curious to see your take on this. Do you feel like, because you've been gardening now for over 30 years, and do you feel when you start a garden or when you started your garden, you put some plants in the ground and then you continue to add plants? Do you feel at some point there's a tipping point where it goes from being just some plants in the ground to becoming an ecological whole as a garden?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you start gardening, I think the problem is when people start growing roses in America in any event, and we have a couple of rosarians on our trip who are just beginning rosarian, and they keep asking questions. The questions that they are asking are different than what you would be thinking about as you keep gardening and getting more experience in the garden and learning things from your garden. The focus on all these questions is, the rose. And as you get experience in your garden, you're also looking at all the other plants that are not only making your garden look better, because you just don't want to just have roses in your garden, that monoculture of roses, but you're also creating a habitat, the beautiful design for your garden, but also the beautiful habitat for all these other insects that are coming in, searching for nectar and pollens, and then overwintering and staying.
And that becomes the relation. I mean, creating that habitat is what indeed allows you to garden organically.
Yeah.
And we see that in the gardens we've seen here. I mean, yesterday, we were in a little town called Chamboif, which is the Mion family
Yeah.
history in the little village there. And like you said, the signs you were talking about, I mean, every 5 feet had a sign, and there were bumblebees and hummingbirds and all
Yeah.
kinds of wonderful things. And
You
I know
know,
you
they
have some notes and observations. You're a copious note taker, by the way. I see you writing all the time on the bus.
they had some lovely little sayings in French along the way. One of them was, "Friendship is a flower, love is a rose." And of course, in French, it probably sounds a lot nicer,
That
but
tends to be the case.
yeah, there's something about that French language. It's just wonderful to hear. But then another one was, "If your heart is a rose, your mouth speaks words of perfume." I
Mm,
thought that was
I
lovely.
like that one.
And then there were many of them. And another one was, "Like a rose, the smile is the universal language."
That's a nice one too. I
That's a
like that
nice
one.
one too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, in that garden, there were signs about the dangers to wildlife, with pesticide use. There was also signs about how we should be using compost. And I noticed in that garden, you see the beauty of each of these roses. The meandro, and they were mainly meand roses, beautiful, beautiful roses. But you also saw large drifts of color that they just had grouped the roses and the companion plants so beautifully. So you've got all these drifts of color. I don't know if you grow Jan Arthurus Bertrand. Do you grow that
No, I
rose?
don't know that one.
It's a lovely single. I really have an affinity for single petal roses
Raising
because,
my hand here on that one.
yeah, I love to see bees and bumblebees. So many bumblebees here. So many. I've taken some really wonderful photos. And Jan Arthurus Bertrand was actually an environmentalist. I love that rose. I have one of them and I treasure it. It's a rose that I got from Bob Martin's garden after he passed. So, it has a special place in
Some
my heart.
sentimental value with
Yeah,
that too, because you and
sentimental
Bob are very
value.
close.
They had drifts. They had so many of those, grouped together, and it's a beautiful, it changes color. It's goes from a pink to an orange, and it's got these lovely, lovely bright yellow stamens with a little bit of crimson in the stamens as well.
Yeah,
Very
those are the pretty ones. Yeah, I like the singles as well for the reasons you mentioned. First of all, I love seeing the stamens. And a lot of times the stamens are almost a contrasting color. I was looking at one at Andreev's nursery last week when I was there. It was a white with almost burgundy stamens, and it was incredibly striking. But like you said, those are the single-petaled roses are the ones that bring in the bees and the
Yeah.
pollinators. And there's a beneficial aspect to
Yeah.
those.
You know, two other roses that I noticed in the Mayond in Chambeuf was Francis Dubray and Papa Mayond.
Yes,
You know,
two
and with
beautiful
those,
reds.
yeah, and those, and you know, those are really, really fragrant roses. So they really do concentrate on the fragrance as well. Another thing that I think that we all noticed was that we would see a rose and we'd think we knew which rose it was, but it was a different name. Like I thought I saw Dainty Bess, but it was named something else. So whether or not the rose just has a different name, or whether, you know, with all these crosses that we get, you know, some of them are going to look like sisters. Who knows?
Yeah, they will. I mean, I saw it because you pointed it out to me, and I agree with you. It looks exactly like Danny
Yeah.
Bess. But yeah, is it a different one? It's hard to say sometimes. And of
Yeah.
course, as I've talked about in the past in some podcasts I've done, names change when they go from country to
That's
country.
right.
But I want to go back to a little bit. Some of the quotes that you read, which are interesting. The quotes kind of blur the line in a good way between gardening and life in general. You
Yeah.
know, if you grow a rose, your perfume and your smile, and it relates to more than just gardening. It also relates to the well-being of the human being as a soul.
You know, that is so true. I feel like gardening is mind, body, and soul. It really, really is. You know, I think one of the secrets of success for a gardener is to go out in the garden often. You know, it's just good for us. It's also good for our roses. We have a relationship with our plants. We just do.
And
And if
people
you're
laugh
not,
when we say we talk to our plants, but we do.
well, we do. And if you're not there, you know, in a relationship, you're there for each other. So I go outside and my roses are there for me. They make me happy. They just, you know, you can just take a deep breath and just relax in your garden. And at the same time, I'm there for them. You become familiar. It's like, you know, it's like somebody you know really well. You can tell right away if something's right and if something's wrong. And it's the same thing with your plants. You don't need a whole lot of time. If you don't have a lot of time to garden, that's fine. But go outside, take that deep breath of fresh air, look around, be uplifted with the butterflies and the bees and the beauty of the roses, and then spot the things that could be stressing them out, and nip them in the bud. And then you don't feel the stress of, I've got to use a pesticide because I haven't been in my garden in a month and now everything's a lacy leaf. You know, if you're out there a lot, you just see it, you just deal with it mechanically. You don't need to get to that other portion. I've got a section in the book that's coming out called Zen in the Rose Garden. And, you know, a lot of this is talked about in there, you know, stop and smell the roses, you know.
Yeah. You really do.
Yeah.
And to remind our listeners, the book is Natural Rose Gardening, the Organic Guide to Growing Amazing Roses on pre-sale now. And as I mentioned earlier, you allowed me to write the forward to it, and I did read it, and it's a beautifully written, well done book. I mean,
Thank you.
congratulations
Thank
on
you
it.
for writing that.
Oh, that was my pleasure to do. And I'm going to go back to one thing you talked about just now. You mentioned about going out and observing the plants and seeing what's going on and then reacting to what's going on. And I think to me, that's one of the keys to organic gardening.
Yes.
We're too often, I think, in the time mind frame of I'm going to spray a fungicide even though there's no fungus in the garden. I'm going to spray an insecticide even though there's not really a lot of insects in the garden. And organic gardening is really flipping that on its heels
You
and
know,
saying, I see something, and then what do I do? Or more importantly, what do I not do?
what do I not do? And I think when we don't realize that, that's when we get into big problems. When, first of all, if we don't get into our garden often enough, like I said, we go out there and we have a shock, because there are pests. There's not that many pests. I think I read that there's 97% of the insects in our garden are just there. You know, it's only that there's only 10, maybe 12 pest insects.
Yeah, there's not many, really.
There's not that many. So I think it's really important to educate ourselves. Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we learn which ones are the pests and which ones are the beneficials? People are out there squishing lady beetle larvae. Beetles, they don't look awfully cute until you realize what they are. And then they become really cute looking when you realize they actually do for you. And I think when we realize that our best friends in the garden are the beneficials, there are, they're free pest service. They're going to be there. So I am going to go when I see aphids. I've heard some of the rosarians on this trip saying they don't touch the aphids. The little beetles will come. Yes, they're absolutely right. I don't do that. If I see aphids, I'm going to squish them. I know I'm not going to get them all. There's going to be plenty left, and I know that the lady beetles will come, and the other beneficial insects will come. But if we start messing around with it seems so presumptuous to go out and spray. What are we doing? Nature is so interconnected. When we go out and spray, we've just decided to do something that I feel is quite ignorant, because you don't know what you're actually, the repercussions of what you're doing are not for your benefit and for the benefit of your garden.
No, they're not. And that goes back to the garden as a whole, and realizing that, we say, I'm the gardener.
Yeah.
That's kind of a presumptuous statement if you think about it. No, we're the gardener. We, the gardener, meaning you and I, are in our gardens, but they're also the beneficial insects in our garden. They're the earthworms that are aerating the soil, and so it becomes a whole integration at that point with the garden.
It does.
Yeah, and I think it does. I'm with you. I think it's very presumptuous to sit there and say, and roses, unfortunately, have gotten that reputation. And you went back and you mentioned some of the new rose growers that we have on the tour. They've obviously read, I have to spray fungicides. My roses have to be perfect. And I think a lot of rose growing is unlearning as much as anything else with the information that's out there.
Yeah. Another thing the only disease I've seen while we've been on this trip on the roses, like I mentioned, I've seen very few pests. I have seen black spot, but I haven't seen hardly any other. But I've seen a lot of other plants being grown with the roses. And that is also a key to organic gardening, is to grow other plants, because you just don't want to have that monoculture of just roses. And it helps with both the pests and it helps with the fungal diseases as well.
Yeah, well, it creates that entire environment.
Yeah.
And we were talking yesterday, the rose garden we were in yesterday, the second one we were in, which is, I'm going to butcher the name, Saint Galmer, I believe. It's the little town that was not far from Chambois.
Yeah.
And we were met by a woman who was talking about scents in gardens and the scents that plants put out. And she said there's the scents from the flowers. But then, like in the case of the roses, she talked about there were scents from the sepals when the roses are stressed that actually bring beneficial insects into the garden.
Right. So I always knew that we're just the incidental beneficiaries of this wonderful fragrance that roses, produce. But that was really interesting what she was saying. I've heard about how plants talk to each other when they're stressed, and how trees as well. But it is really good to hear. She was actually, we were so lucky to have her there. Her name, let me see if I can find her name, Sylvie Baudino. She has a PhD in biology, and we were just so fortunate that she was there, and she took us on what it was, about 45 minutes.
It's a 45-minute talk about not only about fragrances and how we perceive fragrances, but as we were just talking about how important they are in the garden for the plant health of the plant.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And she told us about the history of perfume making, the science, with the insect aspect of it. She told us about the role of fragrance, and she also talked about our perceptions. And she had like graphs on there, like for what we smell and what insects smell, and what our dogs, they have a whole different thing. So, and everybody has a subjective perception of fragrance.
Yeah, I find the old-fashioned tea roses I've noticed over the years, people either have fragrance for people or they don't have fragrance for
Yeah.
people. That to me has always been the one class that's just a hit or miss for people. But
I know. And sometimes, there's one rose I'm embarrassed to say that Double Delight that everybody can smell and thinks it's like the best smell. I don't smell that. I think I have a really good
yeah, you do have a good nose.
sense of
Yeah.
smell, but when it comes to Double Delight, I can barely smell it. And it was funny because Bob Martin used to not be able to smell fragrant cloud.
Really?
Yeah.
And the name alone, you would think it would have fragrance.
And you've smelled that.
Yeah,
fragrant
yeah,
cloud.
very
I
good
mean,
cloud. Yeah,
it's fantastic.
yeah.
So, it just kind of embarrasses you when you can't smell
I
something
just
that
think
other
there's notes we can smell that with that,
there's no that's and
But she
said
talked
that.
about that.
She said
Yeah.
that, and I was so happy because I was like, okay,
Yeah, because she had a chart that had all these different notes and the strength of them. But she did point out that some people might smell, even though this is a slight scent, that might be very strong for someone. And here's a strong scent that might be zero, which probably Double Delight has the one that you can't,
I can't
the
smell.
note that you can't get to. Yeah.
And the French, I brought the pamphlet with me on that garden because I was so struck with that garden. Beautiful. It was all in bloom. There were some modern roses, there were some David Austin roses, but there were a lot of old roses and old roses that I've read about, I've seen in pictures, but I haven't seen in person. I'd never seen Belle Isis, the one that David Austin used in his breeding.
That's where he got the myrrh fragrance from that he's so known for, the signature fragrance. Yeah.
I was able to, see it and photograph it and put my nose in it. It was what a great opportunity. And I noticed that their pamphlet called that garden in French. I won't say it in French, but a haven of peace and serenity. I think they really captured what it was. There was so much beauty and it was romantic. And then all this visual beauty and the fragrances. I didn't want to leave. I feel like
we had to push
everything,
you on the bus. I remember that.
everything on this tour has been wonderful, except it's like, oh, can't we just stay a little bit longer? That's the hard part on something like this is tearing
I know.
yourself away from a place that you could just.
And what I find with these gardens, so Saint Jean Mer was not a huge garden by standards of
Yeah.
other gardens we've seen. It wasn't one of these grand estates. I mean, I think they had about maybe 300 varieties of roses. They didn't have necessarily somewhere we're looking at 500 roses, which sounds like a lot, but in a public garden, and it was a public garden, that's not a lot. But sometimes the smaller ones can be the most charming.
Yeah, and it was beautifully planted. I took a lot of lovely photographs, not just of individual blooms, but also, there's some arches and again, back to the companion plants, the colors,
Yeah, it was a beautiful job with the companion plants and stuff. And the companion plants, as they have a value, service all their own. I mean,
Yeah.
in the wintertime, when you don't cut them back, that's where a lot of the beneficials will overwinter. And that's what also brings the beneficials in. And I think they just add beauty.
You know what? Another thing I really liked in this garden that we're talking about is the fact that they had a whole tribute to the Duché family.
And we were there at Fabian and Florence Duché the day before.
So that, which made it extra special because what a lovely couple, beautiful place they have. And when I asked him, about his roses and what he was striving for, the first thing he said was fragrance. And that is actually what, they had this tribute to them. And actually, it actually said, that the family focus, the Duché's focus is on fragrance, which is, I actually realized I didn't know how many of their roses I have. I do have quite a few roses. And I was, in that room that they had, they've got all those, that wall full of all the roses.
Full of picture tags that they come with their roses.
Tags,
yeah.
And it was,
well,
it
I mean,
was
Fabian
wonderful.
and Florence, they're sixth generation of from the family. And and the Duché family, and then Pernay Duché, when it was the roses are absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
But the French focus, I think the Americans tend sometimes to focus on, does it have the high pointed center? Does it have the this? Does it have the that? What's the petal count? What's the that?
We haven't heard that at all here.
The French don't focus on statistics. I always say my favorite thing, the French breed roses from the heart, not from the head.
Yeah. When we went to the Duché families, first thing we did was walk into that room, and there was a room, they were distilling petals. The whole room, it was just, talk about a sensory this wonderful, wonderful experience where you're just smelling these wonderful petals. And she was making rose water. She was distilling petals to make rose water and also the rose oil. And of course, if you're not growing organically, you can't be doing that. So it's
And
just
rosehip
this, yet
jelly,
one
rosehip
more
jam.
reason,
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is a very good reason to grow organically.
Yeah.
So now just, and having, we're about 3 or 4 days into being here in France and you've done the English garden and you've traveled a lot extensively. This isn't your first time over here, certainly. So when you look back and now, and if you wanted to talk to some of the new gardeners or if you wanted to talk to gardeners in America who are just getting into roses and they are reading what is sadly, in my opinion, prevalent literature about you have to have a fungicide program and you have to have a pesticide program, what would you want to say to them?
One of the reasons I wrote the book I wrote was because I want to spread the joy of growing roses. I want to spread the joy of roses. But I think my mission is to let people know that growing roses, if you select the right roses, and we'll get to that in a minute, if you select the right roses, it's not hard. And you do not need pesticides and fungicides. In fact, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing nature a disservice, yourself a disservice, because like I said, we're interconnected. We're all helping us. Nature can help us when we just appreciate nature and leave it alone. It does its own thing. So I would say, don't do it. Don't listen to it. And sort your priorities. Do you really need to have perfect roses? You don't. There's going to be plenty of roses that, some of the roses will get caterpillar damage. There's going to be plenty of them that are going to be fine, especially if you're out there, uh, you know, taking care of them like what you should be doing, giving them what they want. Grow them culturally. I'm not saying plant a rose and then forget about it and everything's going to be okay. What I'm saying is take the time to select the right rose for your region.
Yeah, that's certainly a
Which is
key.
so important. You're just going to get frustrated if you just buy a rose without any research as to what you should be growing in your region, because there are many, many great roses. But, a rose that I see here might not do well in my garden.
No, they don't. And I think that's always the thing that everybody needs to realize. Not every rose does well in every part of the country, even every part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So select the right rose and then have a relationship with it. Get out there. This is your garden. Be an artist in your own garden. I think you've got to have your basic recipe of, you select the right rose, you give it what it wants. It's not a shade plant. Plant it in the sun, plant it well, prune it. Pruning is very helpful, because you're taking out damage. You're growing the rose to its best ability. You're taking out dead canes. You're opening up space for new canes. So you're making the rose look better, but you're also helping yourself because you're going to get more roses and healthier roses when you do that. And then fertilize, but not too much. So you'll go to a rose care seminar and they might tell you, okay, every 7 to 10 days you've got to spray, and every 2 weeks you've got to fertilize. And that is not, first of all, it's not necessary. And secondly, it's going to backfire. It's going to suck the fun out of gardening.
Well, and also it goes back to picking up on what you said about a minute ago. If you go to a seminar and they say, here's your fertilizer program and you have to do this every 10 days and you do this alternating spray every 7 or 8 weeks, or every 7 or 8 days, that's not giving what you said is you need to give the rose what it needs. That's giving the rose what we think, which is an incredibly presumptuous, egotistical thing to do. If you think about it, we think we know better. No, the rose knows better.
Yeah.
We need to listen.
And again, it's that focus on the rose and not on the garden. And a rose is a garden plant. We don't need to treat it like it's something that needs so much fertilizer. It really, really doesn't.
It needs nature.
Yeah. We asked Madame Margot in her beautiful garden. I asked her what she fertilizes with, and she said she puts down compost and a mulch. I put down organic fertilizer. I do it 2 or 3 times a year, a granular. And then I'll keep an eye, and then I'll cover that with worm castings and compost and mulch.
Yeah,
And that's pretty much it.
but you're feeding the soil as well as feeding.
Yes,
And that's again the
a
whole
living
garden.
soil. You want,
Yeah.
there's so much that goes on in a soil. I can't even tell you. I wish I knew, but
We're scratching the surface and barely learning.
Yeah.
But a garden is not only above the ground; a garden's below the ground.
So
That's the whole environment.
That's exactly right. And I don't know all the details of it because I'm not a scientist, but I do know that if you're using synthetic fertilizers, high numbers, the 20-20-20s, and they're synthetic, you're not helping your soil at all. You're not building that soil. But you're adding salts to the soil, and you're adding way too much, giving
You could be adding too much magnesium.
Yeah, and then this myth about, okay, you've got to add Epsom salts. Well, why would you do that? Why would you do that?
Well, my always thing is with Epsom salts and Linda Walker Scott wrote a really good article on it. First of all, I always tell people, well, need to add Epsom salts and need to add iron. Okay, well, have you done a soil test?
Yes.
That's like going to the doctor and saying, I need penicillin.
Yeah.
Well, what's wrong with you? I don't know. I just need it.
Yeah.
No, let's do some examinations first.
Yeah, if you're growing your roses and you're adding just minimal amounts of fertilizer, organic, and compost and earthworm castings and a mulch, everything should be doing okay. If it isn't, don't just think, okay, well, it needs fertilizer. That seems to be like what the first thing most people will think.
They'll ask me, I need to feed it.
I'm going to feed it. So at that point, you should do a soil test, and it's actually, for the amount you spend for it, like $35, you gain so much time because now you're fertilizing less. You realize.
Well, you're targeting.
And you're targeting what you need. And usually all you need to add after you've done this, if you've been a rosarian for a few years, you've been adding too much fertilizer usually. And so by the time you get your soil test, you realize all you really need is nitrogen. So now you've just saved yourself a lot of time.
Yes, you
and
have.
A lot of money. And, Mark Wyndham's got a funny saying. He calls phosphorus the relative who won't leave.
Oh, yeah.
And how many rosarians
bone meal
just constantly saying they plant it with superphosphate, and then they constantly, because phosphorus gives you bigger blooms,
but you can also overload it.
I think what I would tell a new rosarian is, don't believe everything you're being told by the traditional rose growers. And I love my Rose Society. I think one of the best things you can do is to join the American Rose Society and join your local Rose Society, but don't take everything that you're hearing at face value. Do some research on your own.
But also decide what's your end game?
Yeah, what's your end game?
Yeah.
And it should just be to keep your plants healthy. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by keeping a healthy garden, growing plants other than roses, giving the roses their cultural needs. Give them adequate water. When you water them, make sure that you're getting the water soaking down deep to their roots, and that way, when you do have a drought, the rose is in a better ability because it doesn't have shallow root.
It's got deep root. I do that at home. I have clay soil. We do retain water. I need to preface that, but I don't have an irrigation system at home in South Carolina, and I've gone 3.5 weeks with no rain. And the roses, maybe they drop some foliage, but they do just fine because my roots are very deep.
Yeah. Find out what roses, it's basically an education. And why wouldn't you do it? Find out what a rose needs. Take a class or read a book. What does a rose need culturally? And then, look after your soil. Think about your soil before you add anything to your soil in terms of fertilizer. Think about, is this going to be healthy for my soil? And
we'll start with the soil test and get that. That gives you some idea, and make sure you've got an organic material in the soil. You talk about worm castings, and the analogy I always use is the forest floor, that constant replenishment of organic material into the soil, because all those microorganisms, that's what they need. They need that organic material. That's what they live off of, but then they are beneficial to your plants.
Right.
It's a very symbiotic relationship.
It is. And then the nutrients, when your plant needs the nutrients that are in the soil, with the water, it'll access them when they need it. They're not just being a lot of synthetic fertilizer just dumped on them.
I would say synthetic fertilizer. It's like the Jolt Colas and the high energy drinks of
There
the
you
world.
go. And we don't
You
need
get a
that.
sugar high for about 30 minutes, and then you crash and burn.
And a lot of people, I'm a consulting rosarian. I get photographs from a lot of people. What's the matter with my rose? Well, they burnt the heck out of it. They didn't go out for a long time. They went into their garden to just, and thought, okay, I better fertilize my roses. And because they hadn't fertilized in a while, they did like a double jolt of,
Yeah, they chuck out a bunch of 20,
blue
20,
stuff.
20. If one cup's good, 2 cups will be fabulous.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And then they've burned.
Oh, yeah, they fry them to a crisp when you can over-fertilize them.
Or they'll fertilize them when it's really hot, or they won't water them.
It's been nice to hear the takeaways that you've gotten from being here in France and also having been in England and realizing, and in a way, it's kind of a nice reinforcement because, again, you've written this terrific book on organic rose gardening, and it's been, I think, it's nice to come and see being applied almost on a countrywide basis.
Yeah.
And I think the United States is coming. So one last little observation I want you to just sort of touch upon a little bit. I always like to ask one last question. So we were at dinner last night, and our guide on the tour is Kirsty Ferguson, who has been every tour I've done in Europe, I do with Kirsty through the tour company. And she talked about at some point she can no longer see gardens because they give her indigestion. And you had a completely opposite reaction to that, and you were almost shocked by that statement. So why can you just look at roses and gardens all day long?
When Kirsty said that, I really like Kirsty. But no, she's, that's where we all differ. I could never, ever get rose indigestion. I could go to a rose garden every single day and not be overloaded by roses. I love roses. I have a passion for roses. I could maybe say I've got an addiction for roses. I don't know. It's just, they're so beautiful and so different. And this, they just go straight to your heart. So I know I'm not going to get rose indigestion at any time. I'm not even going to say at any time soon. I'm just going to say at any time. No, keep them coming.
Yep, I'm with you on that. So Rita, thank you so much for joining on the World of Gardening podcast, and bonjour from France.
Yeah, merci beaucoup.